The neon hospital sign buzzed overhead, flickering like a dying pulse. After 16 hours of fighting for other people's lives, Zara Mitchell had nothing left for her own. She saw the sleek black sedan idling through the mist, pulled the door open, and whispered her address, falling into a deep sleep before she realized the man beside her wasn't a driver, but a king of the underworld. Zara Mitchell stepped out of the emergency room, the heavy scent of antiseptic still clinging to her skin. 16 hours of chaos, a triple-car pileup in the ER, the weight of a patient's hand as it went cold in hers. Her green scrubs were wrinkled, her pink backpack felt like it was filled with lead, and the midnight rain turned the streetlights into hazy halos. When she saw the obsidian black car waiting at the curb, she didn't check the license plate. She collapsed into the velvet soft leather, the silence of the cabin wrapping around her like a blanket. She mumbled a tired thank you, closed her eyes. And before she could sense the heavy scent of expensive cologne or the cold steel of the man watching her, exhaustion pulled her under. The heavy door of the sedan closed with a soft, expensive thud, instantly cutting off the roar of the rain and the rhythmic hiss of city traffic. Zara didn't even look at the driver. Her world had narrowed down to the pulsating ache in her calves and the heavy weight of her eyelids. She mumbled her home address, a modest street in a neighborhood that didn't see cars like this, and leaned her head back against the leather. It was too soft for an Uber. The air was too still. It didn't smell like pine freshener or old upholstery. It smelled of expensive sandalwood and the crisp, metallic scent of a cold night. But Zara's brain, fogged by 16 hours of adrenaline and heartbreak, failed to register the warning signs. Her head listed to the side, her pink backpack slipping from her shoulder to the floor mats, and she finally let go. Her temple found something firm yet draped in fine wool, and she drifted into the first dreamless sleep she'd had in weeks. Beside her, Lee Hyun-woo sat perfectly still. He didn't move his shoulder, though the weight of the stranger's head was heavy against him. He didn't signal the two black SUVs following them to intercept. Instead, he looked down. In his world, people didn't close their eyes. They didn't breathe with this kind of rhythmic, defenseless trust. They certainly didn't mistake his private vehicle for a taxi. He looked at the lime-green fabric of her scrubs, the badge clipped to her pocket that read Z. Mitchell, RN, and the way her dark curls spilled across the lapel of his black suit. His driver's eyes met his in the rearview mirror, his hand hovering near the holstered weapon at his side, his expression a silent question. Do I remove her? Hyun-woo watched the way her eyelashes fluttered in her sleep. She looked profoundly human, a stark contrast to the tactical maps and casualty projections currently glowing on his laptop screen. He felt a strange, sharp pang of restraint. To wake her would be to bring her into his world of shadows and steel. To let her sleep was a mercy he didn't usually grant. "Sir," the driver whispered, his voice tight. Hyun-woo reached out, his long fingers hovering just inches from her face, tracing the curve of her jaw without making contact. He could see the faint shadows under her eyes, the mark of a woman who spent her life stitching the world back together while he spent his pulling it apart. "Keep driving," Hyun-woo said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "Take the long way through the district. Drive as if you're carrying glass." As the car glided through the neon-soaked streets of the city, the Mafia boss closed his laptop, letting the darkness of the cabin swallow them both. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking at a target, he was looking at a sanctuary. The transition from sleep to consciousness was usually a violent jerk for Zara, a reflex honed by months of pagers and emergency codes. But this time, it was the silence that woke her. The vibration of the road had vanished, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt heavy. Zara blinked, her vision swimming. The first thing she noticed was the smell, rich, earthy, and decidedly not like her cramped studio apartment. Then she realized her cheek was pressed against something warm and impossibly smooth. She sat up abruptly, her joints groaning in protest, and looked to her left. A man sat there. He was watching her with a composure that bordered on the statuesque, his dark eyes reflecting the dim amber glow of a courtyard lantern outside. He didn't look angry, he looked curious, like an apex predator observing a creature that had wandered into his den by mistake. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone that sent a shiver down Zara's spine, not of fear but of an instinctual awareness that she was in the presence of absolute power. I'm so sorry," Zara stammered, her hands scrambling for her pink backpack. "I must have crashed. Wait, this isn't 4th Avenue. She looked out the tinted window and her heart performed a sickening drop. They weren't on a city street. They were parked beneath a sprawling stone portico of a modern fortress, a glass and steel monolith tucked away behind high walls and iron gates. The car door was open from the outside, but not by a friendly neighbor. A man in a sharp black suit with a coiled earpiece stood at attention, his posture rigid. Beyond him, 3 more. Men paced the perimeter, the unmistakable silhouettes of tactical hardware visible beneath their jackets. This wasn't a neighborhood watch, this was a small army. "Where am I?" Zara asked, her voice trembling as she turned back to the man in the car. "Who are you?" Lee Hyun-woo stepped out of the vehicle, his movements fluid and predatory. He turned and offered a hand to her, a gesture of startling chivalry in a setting that screamed danger. "My name is Lee Hyun-woo," he replied simply. "And you, Zara Mitchell, have spent the last hour sleeping on the shoulder of a man with many enemies. For your own safety, you cannot go home tonight." Zara stared at his outstretched hand, then at the armed guards standing like statues in the rain. The exhaustion that had clouded her mind evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of a woman who realized she hadn't just taken the wrong ride. She had crossed a border into a world where she didn't belong. The dining hall was a cathedral of cold marble and sharp shadows, the air heavy with the scent of braised short ribs and tension. Zara sat at the long obsidian table, her green scrubs a jarring splash of color against the monochromatic elegance. Across from her sat a younger man, Min-ho, whose features mirrored Hyun-woo's but lacked his brother's tempered steel. He was laughing, a bright, careless sound that seemed too fragile for a fortress when the world shattered. The first shot didn't sound like a gun. It sounded like the snap of a high-tension wire. A window high above disintegrated, showering the silk runner in diamonds of glass. Chaos followed with surgical precision. Hyun-woo was on his feet in a heartbeat, his chair skidding back as he lunged toward Zara, his body a shield of heavy wool and hardened intent. "Down!" he roared, but the secondary blast from the courtyard threw the room into a hellish strobe of fire and smoke. In the scramble for cover, a jagged shard of debris or a stray round, Zara couldn't tell which caught Min-ho in the neck. He collapsed not with a cry but with a terrifying wet gurgle. The guards engaged, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed weapons echoing in the halls, but Zara's world had already narrowed to the man choking on his own life on the floor. Hyun-woo reached his brother, his hands hovering, uselessly powerful. "Min-ho, breathe. Move," Zara commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of the ER, a cold, commanding authority that stopped even Hyun-woo in his tracks. She dropped to her knees, her pink backpack abandoned as she tore through the silver service on the table. Min-ho's face was turning a bruised purple, his airway collapsing under a massive hematoma. "He's suffocating," Zara hissed, her fingers flying over his throat, feeling for the anatomy amidst the blood. She grabbed a silver paring knife from a fruit plate, the blade sharp enough to glide through silk. "I need a straw, a hard plastic one, now." One of the stunned guards fumbled a sturdy boba straw from a drink tray. Zara didn't hesitate. With the steady hand of a woman who had looked death in the eye every night for a decade, she made a precise, horizontal incision just below the vocal cords. Blood bubbled, hot and red, staining her hands and the white silk of Min-ho's shirt. She slid the straw into the opening, creating a crude, life-saving vent. A ragged, whistling breath pulled through the plastic tube. Min-ho's chest rose. The purple faded from his lips. Zara stayed there, her knees in the blood, her hands steadying the straw as the gunfire outside faded into a grim silence. She looked up to find Hyun-woo staring at her. The fascination in his eyes had hardened into something deeper, an intense, terrifying respect. He realized then that while his world was built on taking lives, this woman was a force that could snatch them back from the grave. The adrenaline that had sustained Zara's steady hands began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, bone-deep tremor. She remained on the floor, her fingers still hovering near Min-ho's throat as a team of private medics rushed into the room to take over. They worked with the same clinical efficiency she practiced at the hospital, but their holstered sidearms reminded her that this was no ordinary trauma center. Lee Hyun-woo stood over her, his silhouette tall and imposing against the flickering light of the damaged hall. He didn't look at the blood on his floors or the shattered glass of the windows. He looked only at Zara. He reached down, his large hand wrapping firmly but gently around her arm to pull her to her feet. The silk of his sleeve was ruined, soaked through with his brother's blood, but he seemed utterly indifferent to it. "You saved him," he said, his voice a low, vibrating chord in the quiet room. "You didn't run, you didn't scream, you stayed and you fought for a life you didn't even know." Zara wiped her hands on her stained green scrubs, the fabric now a dark, heavy olive. "I'm a nurse, Mr. Lee. It's what I do. Now, please, I need to go home. I have a shift tomorrow." Lee Hyun-woo's grip didn't loosen, but his thumb brushed almost imperceptibly against the skin of her wrist. "The men who did this, they saw your face. They saw you save the heir to the Lee syndicate. In their eyes, you are no longer a bystander. You are an asset or a target." He turned to his head of security, a man whose face was a mask of stone. "Prepare the east wing. Secure the perimeter. No one enters or leaves without my personal clearance." "Wait," Zara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You can't keep me here. This was a mistake. I just got into the wrong car." Lee Hyun-woo stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the faint, iron tang of the night air on his skin. He looked down at her with an expression that was both predatory and profoundly protective. "In my culture, there is a debt of life," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "You saved my brother's breath. Until that debt is settled and the people who tried to take it are dealt with, you belong to the protection of the House of Lee. You will stay where I can see you." He signaled to a maid standing in the shadows. "Take Miss Mitchell to her quarters. Find her anything she needs. If a single hair on her head is harmed, it is your life." Zara watched him walk away, his stride confident and lethal. She was no longer a nurse on a long shift. She was a guest in a golden cage, bound to a man who saw her life-saving hands as a treasure he wasn't yet ready to release. The East Wing was a sanctuary of silence, far removed from the violent echoes of the dining hall. Zara spent the first 2 days packing the expanse of her suite, the luxury of the silk sheets, and the rain shower feeling like a mockery of her captivity. By the third night, the restlessness drove her out into the hallway, where the soft glow of recessed lighting led her toward a library that felt more like a museum than a home. She found Lee Hyun-woo there, but he wasn't the man she had seen under the portico or the commander who had ordered her confinement. He was sitting in a low leather chair, his suit jacket discarded, and his white sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a single jagged scar that disappeared into his cuff. He wasn't holding a weapon or a ledger. He was holding a charcoal pencil, his eyes fixed on a delicate, unfinished sketch of a crane mid-flight. Zara lingered in the doorway, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. "I didn't take you for an artist," she said softly. Lee Hyun-woo didn't flinch. He set the pencil down with practiced, deliberate care. "It was my mother's passion. In this house, we are taught to destroy things before they can destroy us. She was the only one who believed in the necessity of creating." He gestured to the walls, which were lined not with trophies of conquest, but with breathtaking ink washes and oil paintings that vibrated with suppressed emotion. "These are the only parts of this heritage that don't smell of gunpowder." Zara walked closer, looking at the sketch. The lines were precise yet soulful, the work of a man who observed the world with a painful amount of detail. "You talk about your heritage like it's a sentence, not an empire." "It is both," he replied, his gaze shifting from the paper to her. The intensity in his eyes wasn't the cold fire of the syndicate boss. It was the weariness of a man carrying a mountain on his back. "I was born into a war that started 3 generations before I took my first breath. My life is a series of obligations to dead men." He stood up, walking toward a small painting of a tranquil Korean mountain range. You save lives because you choose to, Zara. I take them because I have to. That is the distance between us. For the first time, Zara didn't see the dragon of the Lee syndicate. She saw a man who was as much a prisoner of his name as she was of his walls. She reached out, her fingers grazing a heavy bronze sculpture on a nearby plinth. "We both work with the things people are afraid of," she murmured. "You just don't have anyone to tell you when your shift is over." The silence that followed wasn't heavy with threat, but with an unspoken understanding. In the dim light of the library, the nurse and the monster shared a moment of quiet, human recognition. Two people exhausted by the roles the world had forced them to play. The fluorescent lights of the hospital felt thinner than Zara remembered, their buzzing a shrill intrusion compared to the heavy, velvet silence of the Lee estate. After 4 days of protection, Lee Hyun-woo had finally allowed her to return to work, but the freedom felt illusory. She stood at the central nursing station, her fingers hovering over a patient's chart, but her mind was miles away, anchored to the image of a man sketching cranes in the moonlight. "Zara, you're starring again," her coworker Marcus whispered, nudging her shoulder. "You've been a ghost since you pulled that double. Everything okay?" "Just tired," she lied, the words tasting like ash. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had performed a makeshift tracheotomy with a boba straw and a paring knife. Here, she was just a nurse again, tasked with checking vitals and changing IV bags. The high-stakes adrenaline of the fortress had rewritten her nervous system, making the routine of the ER feel strangely hollow, like a play she no longer knew the lines to. But the real world was no longer safe. As she moved toward room 402, she caught a glimpse of a man in a nondescript gray hoodie sitting in the waiting area. He wasn't reading a magazine. His eyes were fixed on the reflection in the glass door, tracking her every movement. A cold dread settled in her stomach. She knew that look, the practiced peripheral gaze of a sentinel. She didn't know if he was one of Lee Hyun-woo's shadows or a scout for the rivals who had shattered the dining room windows, and that uncertainty was a poison. During her lunch break, she stepped out into the damp air of the ambulance bay, seeking a moment of clarity. A black sedan, not a luxury model but something meant to blend in, was parked across the street. The driver didn't look away when she made eye contact. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that she was being monitored, a piece on a chessboard she didn't fully understand. She checked her phone. No messages from the hospital administration, just a single notification from an unknown encrypted number. "Eat. You haven't had a break in 5 hours." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The outside world was gone. The boundaries had dissolved the moment she fell asleep in the wrong car. Her friends were just people who didn't know she was a target, and her workplace was now a battlefield waiting for the first shot. She wasn't just Zara Mitchell anymore. She was a variable in a syndicate war, and the man who claimed to protect her had woven her so deeply into his web that even the air she breathed felt like it belonged to him. The shift change was always the most dangerous time, a blur of exhausted bodies and distracted minds. Zara was heading to the employee parking lot, her keys tight in her hand, when the shadow emerged from behind a concrete pillar. It wasn't the silent, respectful presence of Lee Hyun-woo's men. This was a jagged, oily coldness. A man with a face like a serrated blade stepped into the light. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he held out a small, amber glass vial. It looked like any other medication from the hospital pharmacy, innocent and sterile. "Mr. Lee is a sick man in his own way," the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "He trusts you now. He lets you near his tea, his wounds, his bedside. 1 cc of this in his evening dose and you can go back to being a ghost. No more guards, no more targets on your back. We'll even provide the relocation fee. You can be a nurse in Hawaii by sunrise." Zara looked at the vial, her heart drumming against her ribs. This was the way out she had prayed for, the chance to scrub the scent of expensive sandalwood and iron from her life and return to a world that made sense. She thought of the hospital's fluorescent hum and the simple safety of a life where she didn't know the names of Mafia heirs. "Why me?" she whispered. "Because he won't see it coming from the woman who saved his brother. You're his only blind spot." The man pressed the vial into her palm. His skin was cold, devoid of the strange, hidden warmth she had felt from Lee Hyun-woo in the library. He slipped back into the shadows, leaving her with the weight of a kingdom in her hand. That night, the fortress felt heavier than usual. Zara stood in the private dispensary, the amber vial sitting on the marble counter next to Lee Hyun-woo's prescribed antibiotics. The choice was a surgical line: save herself and kill the monster, or protect the monster and lose herself. She thought of Lee Hyun-woo's charcoal sketches, the cranes that wanted to fly but were bound to the paper. She thought of the way he had watched her sleep, not as a predator, but as a man who had forgotten what peace looked like. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who had shielded her with his own body without a second thought. When the door opened, Lee Hyun-woo walked in, looking weary, his tie loosened and his dark hair disheveled. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second his guard dropped. "You look pale, Zara. Did the hospital take too much from you today?" Zara's fingers tightened around the amber vial in her pocket. She looked at the man who had turned her life into a gilded cage, and then she looked at the trash bin. With a sharp, decisive movement, she pulled the vial out and dropped it into the sharps container, the glass shattering against the bottom. "Someone tried to buy my hands today," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "They wanted me to end the war by ending you." Lee Hyun-woo froze, his eyes darkening into obsidian. He stepped toward her, his presence filling the room, but Zara didn't flinch. She reached out, her fingers grazing his pulse point, not to check his vitals but to ground him. "I chose the monster," she whispered. "Now you better make sure it was worth it." The sirens outside weren't from arriving ambulances. They were the first notes of a funeral dirge. The power in the hospital flickered once, twice, and then died, plunged the emergency room into a terrifying backup generator red. Zara felt the shift in the air before she heard the glass shatter, a heavy, pressurized silence that preceded the storm. "They're here," she whispered, her hands instinctively clutching a tray of trauma supplies. The double doors of the ambulance bay burst open, but it wasn't a patient on a gurney. It was Lee Hyun-woo. He moved through the chaos like a shadow made of steel, a suppressed submachine gun held low against his thigh. He wasn't wearing the tailored suit of a businessman. He wore tactical black, his eyes scanning the corridors with a lethal, focused intensity. "Zara, get the patients to the interior wards. Now," he commanded, his voice cutting through the rising screams of the staff. The first volley of gunfire chewed through the drywall of the waiting room. Zara didn't scream. She didn't freeze. The savior complex that had governed her life took over, merging with the cold survival instinct she had learned in the Lee fortress. She lunged for a terrified elderly man in a wheelchair, shoving him toward the central supply closet. "Marcus, use the service elevator for the non-ambulatory. Go." Bullets raked the nursing station, sending plastic folders and computer monitors exploding into the air. Lee Hyun-woo returned fire, his movements a brutal, efficient dance. He used a heavy metal crash cart as a rolling shield, pushing it forward to close the gap between him and the gunmen infiltrating the lobby. "Behind you!" Zara shrieked. A rival enforcer had rounded the corner of the triage desk, leveling a shotgun at Lee Hyun-woo's back. Without thinking, Zara hurled a heavy oxygen tank from the floor. It struck the man's shoulder, throwing his aim off just as Lee Hyun-woo spun, neutralizing the threat with a double tap to the chest. Lee Hyun-woo reached her in 2 strides, pinning her against the wall as a grenade detonated in the parking lot, blowing out the remaining windows. Smoke, thick and smelling of ozone, filled the hallway. He pressed his forehead against hers for a fleeting, desperate second. "I told you to stay at the estate," he rasped, his hand cupping the back of her neck, checking her for wounds. "And I told you I have a shift," she shot back, her green scrubs now blackened by soot and blood. "There are 12 people in the ICU who can't move. If you want to protect me, protect them." Lee Hyun-woo looked at the woman he had tried to cage, realizing she was never the prey, she was the heartbeat of the battlefield. "Hold the line here," he told his remaining men. "The nurse is in command of the floor. You die before a single patient is touched." As the syndicate war turned the halls of healing into a slaughterhouse, the Mafia boss and the nurse stood back to back, one holding a weapon of death, the other a kit for life, refusing to let the darkness take the ground they stood on. The smoke from the hospital siege eventually cleared, but the world it left behind was fundamentally altered. In the months that followed, the Lee syndicate underwent a quiet, clinical dissection. Lee Hyun-woo dismantled the machinery of violence with the same surgical precision Zara used to mend bone and skin. He cut away the rot of the narcotics trade and the shadows of the protection rackets, pivoting the vast resources of his family into logistics, global shipping, and most notably, a foundation for urban trauma centers. He was still a king, but he was no longer a warlord. He had learned that true power wasn't in the ability to take a breath, but in the strength required to protect one. For Zara, life returned to a rhythm that looked familiar on the surface but felt entirely new underneath. She still wore the green scrubs, she still walked the halls of the ER, and she still felt the familiar ache in her feet after a 16-hour grind. But the hyper-independence that once isolated her had softened. She no longer felt she had to carry the weight of the world alone. She knew there was a shadow behind her, one that didn't loom but supported. The hospital air was cool as Zara stepped out of the sliding glass doors into the midnight mist. The neon sign overhead buzzed with a steady, healthy hum. She adjusted the strap of her pink backpack and exhaled, a long plume of white breath curling into the damp air. At the curb, a sleek black sedan sat idling. It was the same model as that first night, the obsidian paint reflecting the city lights like a dark mirror, but the energy radiating from it was different. There were no armed sentries packing the sidewalk, no tinted windows hiding tactical maps or cold steel. The rear door didn't wait for a driver in a mask of stone to open it. Instead, the man himself stepped out. Lee Hyun-woo stood in the rain, his black coat open, his posture relaxed and open. The lethal edge was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, restrained warmth that was reserved for her alone. He didn't look like a man with many enemies. He looked like a man who had finally found his way home. Zara stopped at the edge of the pavement, a tired smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't call for a ride," she teased, her voice soft in the quiet of the night. "I know," Hyun-woo replied, stepping toward her until the scent of sandalwood and rain enveloped her. He reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek before tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "But I've learned that you have a habit of getting into the wrong cars. I thought I'd make sure you finally got into the right one." He opened the door for her, his gaze lingering on her face with an intensity that promised sanctuary. Zara climbed into the velvet warmth of the backseat, but she didn't fall asleep this time. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining, the healer and the reformed monster, as the car glided away from the hospital and into a future they had fought to build together. I hope you enjoyed this journey with Zara and Hyun-woo.